The Professor's Prophecy. Eleanor Vance, at 78, found a certain solace in the methodical unpacking. Each box, taped and labeled with her meticulous hand, was a small victory in the downsizing of her life. Her husband, George, had passed 5 years ago, leaving her in their rambling Boston brownstone, a house suddenly too large for one person, too full of echoes. The new apartment, smaller, brighter, offered a fresh start, a canvas for a simpler life. Yet the old habits persisted. She found herself lingering over items, each one a tangible link to a past that felt both distant and incredibly close. Today, it was the college mementos box, dusty and forgotten in the attic for decades. Inside, nestled beneath a stack of faded yearbooks and crumpled dance programs, her fingers brushed against a stiff, yellowed piece of cardstock. It was the program for the 1965 Finch Memorial Poetry Slam, an annual literary competition at Sterling University. Her name, Eleanor Vance, was circled in bold, confident ink, a stark contrast to the trembling uncertainty of her 19-year-old self. A wave of memory, sharp and vivid, washed over her, pulling her back to that pivotal autumn. She remembered the musty scent of old lecture halls, the ceaseless hum of anxious chatter in the library, and the suffocating feeling of being utterly lost. She'd been a second-year student then, teetering on the brink of dropping out, convinced she was wasting her parents' hard-earned money and her own precious time. College felt like a foreign country she couldn't navigate, a language she couldn't speak. She was a bird trapped in a cage, longing for the open sky of home, even if home offered little more than her small-town familiarity. But then there was Professor Alistair Finch. The name on the program stirred a complex mix of guilt and a profound, unarticulated gratitude. He was an eccentric figure, Professor Finch, with his rumpled tweed suits, perpetually disheveled hair, and eyes that seemed to see right through you, past the nervous smiles and carefully constructed facades, straight into the chaotic heart of a confused teenager. He had seen something in young Ellie Vance that she herself was utterly blind to. He had insisted, simply insisted, that she participate in that contest. And now, decades later, the quiet, unwavering force of his belief still resonated within her. Fall 1965. The air in Boston was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and distant promise. For 19-year-old Eleanor, however, the promise felt hollow. She sat in the crowded lecture hall, ostensibly listening to Professor Finch dissecting a Keats poem. But her mind was a whirlwind of anxieties. Financial aid was tightening, her grades were mediocre, and the sense of belonging that seemed to envelop other students eluded her completely. She felt like a phantom, walking through life, unseen and unheard. Miss Vance, Professor Finch's voice, surprisingly resonant despite his slight frame, cut through her thoughts. He was standing by her desk, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her. Your essay on the romantic paradox was insightful. There's a raw honesty in your prose, a unique perspective often lost in academic rigidity. Ellie mumbled a thank you, her cheeks burning. She'd always found solace in writing, pouring her deepest thoughts onto paper, but she considered it a private indulgence, not something for public scrutiny. However, he continued, a faint smile playing on his lips, you seem adrift, Miss Vance, like a ship without a rudder. Tell me, are you finding your footing here at Sterling?" The bluntness startled her. I'm considering taking a break, Professor." "Maybe not coming back next semester." The words, once a secret, now hung in the air, exposed and vulnerable. Professor Finch leaned against her desk, his gaze unwavering. "A break? Or an escape, Miss Vance? I believe you have a voice. A strong one that deserves to be heard." He paused, then dropped a bomb. "I want you to participate in the Finch Memorial Poetry Slam this year." Ellie's jaw dropped. The poetry slam? Me? "Professor, I can't. I don't write poetry. Not really. And I certainly can't perform it in front of people." The idea was terrifying. Public speaking was her nightmare. She'd rather dissect a frog than stand on a stage. "Nonsense," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Your prose carries the rhythm of poetry, Miss Vance, and performance is merely an extension of expression. It's about conveying truth, your truth." He placed a hand on her shoulder, a light, reassuring weight. "Think on it. I believe this could be transformative for you." His belief, so unexpected, so unwavering, chipped away at her resolve. She tried to refuse, citing lack of time, lack of talent, lack of courage. But he was relentless, his insistence bordering on gentle coercion. He'd corner her after class, weave notes on her desk, always mentioning the poetry slam, always praising some small detail in her writing, a turn of phrase, a metaphor. "It's important, Miss Vance," he'd often say, his eyes twinkling. "More important than you know. There are invisible threads, you see, weaving our destinies. Sometimes we just need a little tug to follow them." Finally, exhausted by his persistence and secretly flattered by his unwavering attention, Ellie conceded, "Okay, Professor, I'll try." The words felt like a betrayal of her own quiet nature, a surrender to the unknown. The weeks that followed were a blur of self-doubt and agonizing creation. Ellie struggled to write a poem, anything that felt authentic. Professor Finch scheduled extra sessions with her, not in his office, but in a small, seldom-used lecture hall, its empty seats amplifying her nervousness. He didn't tell her what to write, didn't offer specific critiques of her nascent verses. Instead, he made her read aloud, listened intently, then asked probing questions. "What are you truly feeling, Eleanor? What image burns brightest in your mind? Let it out. Don't hide." He pushed her to explore her own experiences, her sense of alienation, her longing for purpose. Slowly, haltingly, words began to flow. A poem about a fragmented map, a compass spinning wildly. A journey through a labyrinth, she called, the architect of shadows. It was raw, deeply personal, filled with metaphors of structure and design, a nascent language for her unspoken anxieties. "Excellent, Miss Vance," he'd say, a rare smile gracing his lips. "You are not merely writing words, you are constructing meaning, building bridges. That's what poetry truly is, you know? An act of construction." He never explained why this contest, this performance, mattered so much to him. Beyond it being a tribute to his late mentor, Professor Finch, he just kept reiterating the importance of her participation. "Some opportunities present themselves only once, Eleanor. You must be ready to seize them, even if you don't yet understand their full significance." The night of the Finch Memorial Poetry Slam arrived, a whirlwind of nervous energy. The auditorium was packed, a sea of unfamiliar faces. Ellie's stomach churned. Her poem, The Architect of Shadows, felt flimsy, inadequate. She wished the floor would swallow her whole. When her name was called, Eleanor Vance, announced with a booming enthusiasm by the event's host, she felt a wave of nausea. Her legs felt like lead as she shuffled to the podium, the bright stage lights blinding her. She gripped the microphone, her knuckles white. Her throat was dry, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked out at the sea of faces. Then, instinctively, her eyes sought out Professor Finch in the front row. He met her gaze, offering a small, encouraging nod, his eyes twinkling with that familiar, knowing light. Taking a deep breath, she began to read, her voice a reedy whisper at first. My compass spins in endless dread, a labyrinth within my head. Each path I choose, a phantom's chase, lost in this bewildering space. As she continued, something shifted. The words, once merely lines on a page, began to take on a life of their own. She wasn't just reading, she was reliving, experiencing. Her voice gained strength, rising and falling with the emotion of the poem. The metaphors, once abstract, felt intensely real. She spoke of blueprints of hope, of crumbling foundations, of the desperate need to build something solid, something true, out of the chaos. She spoke not just for herself, but for every lost soul searching for their place. She didn't just perform, she unburdened. When she finished, the auditorium was silent for a beat, a collective holding of breath. Then a roar of applause erupted, loud and sustained, echoing through the hall. She stood there, dazed, a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration coursing through her. She had done it. She had truly spoken. The aftermath was a blur. Congratulatory murmurs, flashing cameras, the bewildering realization that she had not just survived, but thrived. Professor Finch approached her backstage, a proud smile on his face. Remarkable, Eleanor, truly remarkable. He squeezed her hand. Remember what I said about building bridges? You built an entire city tonight. Before she could respond, a distinguished-looking man, tall and imposing, with a sharp gaze, approached them. He introduced himself as Arthur Sterling, a prominent architect and alumnus, and one of the competition judges. Miss Vance, he said, his voice deep and thoughtful. Your poem, it wasn't just words, it was a structure. I've never heard such a clear articulation of spatial anxiety, of the human desire for form and order. You speak in blueprints, even in poetry. Ellie, still reeling from the performance, could only stammer. Thank you, sir, but I'm a literature student. No, Sterling interrupted, his eyes gleaming with an almost visionary zeal. You are a builder, Miss Vance. Not of verse, perhaps, but of vision. Your clarity of thought, your ability to conceptualize space, even metaphorically, it's a rare gift. I'm looking for a new intern for my firm, a young mind with a fresh perspective. I believe you possess that. Have you ever considered architecture? Ellie was stunned. Architecture? She had never, not once, thought of it. Her world had been defined by words, by the intangible. Buildings were solid, imposing things, so far removed from her hesitant, uncertain self. But Sterling's words, a builder, vision, resonated with something deep within her, an unspoken longing she hadn't known she possessed. I don't know anything about architecture, she stammered, overwhelmed. "You know how to create, Miss Vance," Sterling replied, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "That is the core. The rest can be taught." He handed her his card, the heavy stock feeling substantial in her trembling hand. "Think about it. My offer stands." The next few days were a whirlwind of frantic thought. She consulted Professor Finch, who simply smiled and said, "Sometimes the universe offers a door we never knew existed. It's up to us to walk through it." With his quiet encouragement and a strange sense of destiny, Ellie decided she wouldn't drop out. She would switch her major. She would take the internship. This one performance, this single act of courage, pushed by an eccentric professor, had irrevocably altered the course of her life. It was a leap of faith into an unknown, exciting future. Decades passed. Eleanor Vance became Eleanor Vance Richards, a renowned architect. Her name synonymous with innovative design and groundbreaking urban planning. She built soaring skyscrapers that touched the clouds, elegant museums that housed priceless art, and sustainable communities that blended seamlessly with nature. Her designs were lauded for their lyrical quality, their subtle understanding of human emotion and spatial harmony, a direct echo of the themes in her long-forgotten poem. She married George, a kind and steady engineer, and they built a beautiful life together, a life that began on that unexpected stage. Now, sitting in her new, smaller apartment, the yellowed program clutched in her hand, Eleanor felt a pang of regret. She had never properly thanked Professor Finch. He had passed away many years ago, a quiet academic who had touched countless lives. She had always meant to write, to visit, to tell him how profoundly he had changed her destiny. But life, with its relentless demands and distractions, had gotten in the way. Just as she was about to put the program back in the box, a small, elegant envelope tucked inside it caught her eye. It was addressed to her in a crisp, unfamiliar script. No return address. The postmark was old, dated just a few months after Professor Finch's death, years ago. How had she missed it? Inside, there was no letter, only a pristine copy of her poem, The Architect of Shadows, typed neatly on heavy paper. At the bottom, a single, handwritten note in familiar ink, Professor Finch's distinct, spidery hand. He just knew this was what you needed to do. Some doors are open not by chance, but by a quiet nudge from those who see the path before us. Eleanor's breath hitched. He knew. The words echoed in her mind, unlocking a deeper understanding. He hadn't just encouraged her, he had guided her. Had he known Arthur Sterling? Had he seen her architectural potential from the beginning? He had used the poetry slam, not as an end in itself, but as a catalyst, a carefully orchestrated event to put her in front of the right person at the right time. He had seen the nascent architect in the timid literature student, seen the builder of structures in the writer of words. He hadn't just believed in her, he had orchestrated her path. A profound sense of peace settled over her, replacing the lingering guilt. Her entire life, her celebrated career, her very trajectory, had been set in motion by the quiet, unwavering belief of one man. He had seen her truth, a truth she herself was blind to. Eleanor, now an elder stateswoman of architecture, felt a new purpose bloom. She decided to establish a scholarship in Professor Alistair Finch's name at Stirling University, specifically for students who were struggling, who felt lost, who needed a nudge to find their true calling, just as she had. It wouldn't be just for literature students. but for anyone seeking their path, reflecting Professor Finch's belief in the hidden potential within each individual, regardless of their declared major. She also wrote a heartfelt letter to the university's alumni office, detailing her story, her profound debt to Professor Finch, and the almost mystical way he had shaped her life. She included a copy of The Architect of Shadows and the mysterious note, asking them to consider establishing a Finch Legacy Fund to celebrate educators who possessed such extraordinary foresight. Her life, filled with the tangible monuments she had built, now felt like a living testament to his quiet genius. The true greatness of a teacher, she realized, lay not just in imparting knowledge, but in the uncanny ability to see the inherent potential in a student, a potential often hidden even from the student themselves, and to gently, persistently guide them towards their true purpose. Professor Alistair Finch had not just taught her literature, he had taught her how to build her life, brick by emotional brick, into something remarkable. He had prophesied her future, and she unknowingly had lived it. And now she could finally thank him, not just with words, but with a legacy that would continue to change lives, one quiet nudge at a time.